Bin Laden. You think they're foes? They're in business together. Daddy Bush knows the Carlyle Group since years before been raking in billions and itching for more. It's blood for oil. We know there's a link. They say Cold War. We say Code Pink. It's blood for oil. We know there's a link. They say Cold War. We say Code Pink. Code Pink for freedom. Code Pink for peace. Code Pink to hunger and war have ceased. Code Pink for women, boys, men, and girls. Together we'll make peace.
Together, men, women, boys, girls, everyone in between. Here we are. We will make peace in this world. Welcome to Code Pink Radio. You are hearing us live, perhaps, on WPFW in Washington, D.C. at 89.3, or perhaps you're listening to us live at WBAI New York, 99.5, or you may be listening to us at one of the Pacific affiliates that are picking us up these days. And if you are, we'd love to hear from you that you are. You could send us a note at info@codepink.org. We're happy to be here in studio. We have not yet self-quarantined. I'm one of your co-hosts, Paki Wieland, with...
This is Teri Mattson, and maybe we are going to be staying here on the air with you.
Until the end of time. But meanwhile, we have a wonderful program today. We've got 3 guests, and as we were talking before the program started, we think the theme is collective punishment. And it plays in with the coronavirus, it plays in with sanctions, it plays in with the U.S. empire.
Political virus.
The political virus called the empire, a.k.a. USA, whose tentacles go everywhere, don't they? I was telling Teri, I woke up this morning thinking, God, the U.S. empire is everywhere. It influences the OAS in regards to our neighbors in the South. It dominates the United Nations all over the world, and of course NATO. So we'll see what this
and
virus
the international
does.
Banking system and currency.
Yes. All this. Well, we'll spend some time, I hope, in the next few months, perhaps, looking at all these sacred cows that may be put out to pasture. But meanwhile, we've got one big thing we'd love you to do if you're not self-quarantining. Tomorrow night, there's a program at Busboys on 5th Street, and that is a fundraiser, but a party, a celebration of the ongoing struggle of the people of Gaza and all of us who are allies across the world. So it's focusing on the flotilla, but there'll be people from Gaza there. And so we'll give you, 2 feet away from anybody else, and you can just, elbow bump or whatever you want to do. But if
somebody was foot tapping me the other night as the welcome to the dinner party.
Yes,
we're not going to do hands, elbows, anything. Just like
hip hugging.
We used to call that the bump in the 70s or the 80s during the disco era, right?
We had the bump, yes. So it's these are interesting times we are living in. Every now and then I'm reflecting on that. May you live in interesting times, and I every now and then I think, well, these are the interesting times, and the next thing you know,
something else happens.
It gets more interesting.
It's never boring. It's almost surreal.
Well, that's what you were saying this morning. It feels surreal.
It's just surreal. Yeah. It's like I forget, and I'm embarrassed to admit this in front of our listeners, but one of the philosophers who explained that the reality, we don't really know what we think is reality is really something that we're dreaming. And that we're not conscious. We're asleep and dreaming. And so that's kind of what I want to believe, is that we're all going to wake up one day and this will all be over.
I think that.
And if anybody knows which philosopher I'm talking about, please call it and tell me, or send us an email at info@codepink.org.
Yeah. That's, I think, one of the antecedents to people being woke. There
you go.
Yeah. That waking up from this dream that's become a nightmare, and we just don't know what's going to happen next. But stay tuned because we're alive and we are out there in the streets protesting. So come out. And I just heard that people are leery about gatherings inside. But yesterday, I'll just give us a little shout out. There was a CODEPINK protest in front of all places, the Treasury Department. And you might ask why the Treasury Department, and to which I would say because they're the people, that's the department in the United States government that promotes and enforces sanctions. And we know so much about sanctions. Certainly many of us before, not too long ago, we didn't know what sanctions were, but now we do. And so that's the institution of the United States government that enforces it. So we had a lively protest outside. And now that I've filled you in on yesterday's events, we'll move right to today with our first guest.
Well, this is just perfect that you're describing this protest in front of the U.S. Treasury Department, because it's the U.S. Treasury Department that activates U.S. financial sanctions against numerous, I think there's 39 countries under various forms of U.S. unilateral economic sanctions as we speak. And so our first guest this morning is going to talk to us about the Treasury Department sanctions, the actual structure of them and how they work. And our guest is Mike Weisbrot. He's an economist and columnist. He is also director of the Center for Economic Policy, co-director, of the Center for Economic Policy and Research. That is CEPR.net. CEPR, Center for Economic Policy and Research. He is also, and I think probably most important to our conversation this morning, co-authored with Jeffrey Sachs a report last year entitled Economic Sanctions as Collective Punishment, the Case of Venezuela. So, and of course, Venezuela is really in the news this week with the escalation of warring and threatening talk from Elliot Abrams, which maybe we could talk about that a little bit too.
We could do that, but we'll say welcome, Mark.
So welcome, Mark.
Thank you.
So
Thanks
nice to have you back on the show with us again. We so loved your visit with us a month or so ago, and so we're really pleased that you were able to make time for us this morning as well. So
thanks for having me.
Maybe you could just give a quick rundown to our listeners, and I think you would agree that the biggest issue we have right now with the United States is so much of our population does not understand sanctions as warfare, economic warfare, because we don't, as a population, really understand how they work and why they succeed in crippling economies.
Yes, well, they are a form of warfare, and they are targeting the civilian population. And that's why they really are a crime under all kinds of international law. I mean, the sanctions against Venezuela, for example, also violated the Charter of the Organization of the American States, but also the UN Charter and international law, other international laws and treaties that the U.S. is a signatory to. But I think even more strikingly, you can see it. If you look at the big conventions that the U.S. has signed and other countries have signed, the Geneva Convention and the Hague Convention, these are the two major conventions that prohibit war crimes, like crimes during war. And they prohibit exactly this kind of collective punishment. And so the thing is, there's a loophole, and that is these two treaties were designed for warfare. In other words, a situation where you're already killing people as part of the war, and yet you are not allowed to kill civilians in this manner by depriving them of food or water or medicine. Yeah. And so something that is a crime during war, where people are already being killed as part of the war, should be a crime during peacetime. This should be obvious. And yet it's not, it is. but it's not according to those conventions. So that's what I think something that people should know, and we're always trying to convince people in Congress, to make these kinds of things illegal, because again, if it's literally a war crime to do this during a war, then how is it not a crime during peace to impose collective punishment on civilians that kills them? There's tens of thousands of people in Venezuela, for example, that were killed by the sanctions just from 2017 to 2018. And
So if there's no declared war, then you can't commit war crimes. That's the logic, isn't it? And yet,
that's right.
We've heard you and others argue so forcefully that, in fact, sanctions are a form of war, a form of warfare. And so, how do we expand that definition in the larger community of lawmakers to acknowledge that there's war, even if it's not declared war by virtue of guns and weapons, the traditional weapons. But if we looked at and have you and your co-author talked about this idea of the sanctions being active engagement in criminal behavior and warlike behavior against a people's
undeclared war.
Yeah. Well, yes. In our paper, for example, we besides documenting trying to estimate from available data how many people died as a result of these sanctions and how they died, from lack of access to medicine. I mean, we based our analysis on UN estimates of 80,000 people with HIV who didn't have antiretroviral treatment from 2017 to 18, 16,000 people who needed dialysis, 16,000 people with cancer, 4 million people with diabetes and hypertension. So you can get an idea of how many people are subject to this kind of fatal punishment because they can't get essential medicine. But we also looked at, and you can look at this for the case of Iran too, Pompeo made similar statements. Here's a statement from Pompeo in March of 2019, where he's asked by a reporter from the Associated Press, are you satisfied with the pace of the momentum behind Guaido, the self-declared president, and his leadership? And he says, well, we wish things could go faster, but I'm very confident that the tide is moving in the direction of the Venezuelan people and will continue to do so. It doesn't take much for you to see what's really going on here. There. The circle is tightening. The humanitarian crisis is increasing by the hour. I talked with our senior person on the ground there in Venezuela last night. You can see the increasing pain and suffering that the Venezuelan people are suffering from. So he's saying very clearly that this is the purpose of the sanctions, to make people suffer so they will overthrow the government. And he said something just almost exactly the same for the sanctions against Iran. So they make it actually explicit that they're trying to inflict the punishment on the people of the country so that they will rise up and overthrow the government in the hope that the sanctions will be lifted.
Yeah. As you were talking about this, I couldn't help but think about that expression, collateral damage. These are not war crimes. These people's deaths are simply collateral damage. And how to shift that legislative discourse to looking at these as war crimes and not as collateral damage or unfortunate incidents.
Yeah, they're even more directly targeting the civilians than, the bombs that do cause what they call collateral damage, which sometimes is in some ways. They're not, they do kill people by accident sometimes. But this is very, very deliberate.
It's very insidious. And it's I personally really believe that until you someone visits a country that's suffering under sanctions, particularly long term, it's really hard here in the States to understand it as a slow, I think, strangulation of the economy, of access to foods and medicine. And it's literally a slow death for people, whether, it's because they can't get their insulin, or they can't get their cancer treatment, or they can't get, milk for a young child. It's a very slow, sickening form of murder, I guess, in a way. And so many people that we work with and talk to across the country understand sanctions to be less than what they are, I think. That, we tend to think, well, there's no boots on the ground. We're not dropping bombs on people. How bad can sanctions be?
No, it's even, in the discussions here that you see on the Hill, it's kind of included in when people say we're shifting from warfare to diplomacy. The sanctions are part of what they consider to be diplomacy. And, the effects are really very broad for a number of reasons. One is if you cut off oil, hundreds of thousands of barrels of oil from Venezuela, in the August 2017 sanctions, and then even more in January of 2019. You're cutting off the foreign exchange, the dollars that are needed to import any kind of essential medicines, infrastructure, to have clean water, all kinds
to upgrade and maintain your oil extraction industry.
Yeah, and your electricity for the hospitals, everything is either cut off entirely or partially cut off, and then the financial sanctions even before that. So before the 2019 was the oil. Before that, you had financial sanctions in August of 2017, and that also cut off oil because it basically prevented all kinds of borrowing. And of course, you can't function in a modern economy without credit. And it also, in the case of Venezuela, the economy was already in recession, and they had a foreign debt that needed to be restructured. So you couldn't restructure the debt, because restructuring means you have to issue new bonds in exchange for the existing debt. So they prevented the economy from recovering and pushed them further into this deep depression. And that's really important because, economies recover eventually, right? Even the Great Depression.
But you could argue these countries under sanctions now have no tools, no access to recover.
That's right.
Yeah, they have no access to U.S. dollars, which I think a lot of people need to understand. The dominance of the petrodollar in the U.S. banking system allows for this strangulation.
Exactly right. That's what gives the United States Treasury so much power, because the dollar is the world's reserve currency. 60% of central bank reserves are dollars. Most international trade is in dollars. So if you cut them off from dollars, you can cause a balance of payments crisis. And then you have inflation and hyperinflation. And again, hyperinflation doesn't last forever either, in normal circumstances. The average, you had maybe 7 cases of hyperinflation since World War II and in Latin America, and the median length was 4 months. So what happened? You cut Venezuela off from all of this foreign exchange, and you have a balance of payments crisis. The hyperinflation can go on for years, and the depression can go on for years because they can't recover. So this is the power that the United States has as a result of its control of the international financial system. Banks won't even lend, even when they have, so-called humanitarian exceptions for medicine. It doesn't help because the banks won't give them credit for even to import medicine.
You were talking. We've been talking about economic sanctions, and it sounds so clean, just sanctions. It's part of someone referred to it as diplomacy. And yet as I listen to you, all I can see is economic strangulation, that as you describe all these various spheres in which there is no money for anything, for the basics. It's horrific. And I just wonder, we're talking with Mark Weisbrot right now from CEPR.net. And Mark, before you leave, we'd just like to know what's next? What kind of work is being done to end these sanctions?
Well, there is legislation right now that Ilhan Omar is introducing, and it would, it's a first step. It's they're trying to chip away at it, and so I think one of the main things it does is it would prohibit the executive, the president, from instituting sanctions without the consent of Congress, which they do now. So it's kind of like the 1973 War Powers Resolution for war. It's a similar thing, saying that you can't do it without the consent of Congress. Wow. And I think that would be a major step forward, because I think that, at least in the House now, you wouldn't get consent if it actually had to be debated and passed as law.
All right, so we will follow up with you on that Omar bill and co-sponsors
and that's something
more.
That the general public can help push.
So thank you once again for being our guest, and we'll have you back, please.
Mark, you're always so knowledgeable. It's really a pleasure to have you in conversation.
Thank you.
Well, thanks for doing this show. It's really a great contribution, I think.
Thank you.
So So, welcome back, everyone. This is CODEPINK Radio, broadcasting live on WPFW 89.3 FM from Washington, D.C., and we are simulcasting live this morning from WBAI in New York City as well. And we are very pleased to have as our second guest Mr. Carlos Ron. He is the Venezuelan Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs representing North America. Welcome, Carlos.
Thank you. How are you today?
We're very good. We're here in the studio with me and Paki Wieland as well, from CODEPINK, Washington, D.C. And we just finished a fascinating conversation with Mark Weisbrot from the Center for Economic Policy and Research, discussing what economic sanctions are and his report, Economic Sanctions as Collective Punishment, the case of Venezuela. Mm-hmm. And, of course, Venezuela has been in the news recently with your foreign minister filing a suit against the United States for crimes of humanity related to sanctions as collective punishment. And maybe we could talk a little bit about that, and then let's talk about some of the foreign policy issues that are front and center this week for Venezuela and the U.S. as well.
Sure. Well, thank you for the opportunity and to speak to your audience. We like you said, we have taken up the complaint to the International Criminal Court for it to be examined to see if the United States and some of its officials are responsible for crimes against humanity by the imposing of these unilateral measures, or as they call them here, sanctions. We believe that these are a violation of international law, because according to international law, only measures that are approved by the Security Council can be considered real sanctions. otherwise it's a policy from a particular country, and because they also, the effect, and I'm sure Mark went over very well, the effect is not just on leaders or on specific persons like the State Department claims, but it's an actual punishment for the whole collective of Venezuelans. So we had serious applications in healthcare, in our education, in our food organization. All these issues have somehow, all these measures take a toll on this, and this affects the whole population, not just a few, the way they say.
It's the whole population, regardless of political party affiliation, and I think people in the United States need to clearly understand this, that you see one particular faction of the Venezuelan political apparatus working in conjunction with the United States, and then everyone else is suffering this policy that's being implemented by that group of people working in conjunction with the U.S. State Department.
And I think that's one of the differences. In the past, there have been sanctions against a Saudi prince. There has been a sanction against a particular person or leader, a government leader. But this description you're giving that I think is very useful, certainly for me, and I hope for our audience, is what makes this sanction a collective punishment. And so what I'd like to know is is primarily, where is this going? How is this going to court? And how can people in the United States be more aware of it?
I think it will be an interesting result to see what the court says. I mean, the court has already taken the case and agreed to examine it, and so it's in a preliminary phase still. And it's important for you to know that the International Criminal Court is based on the Rome Statute, which is the international agreement that comprises the court, and its purpose is really to seek out crimes against humanity and have take measures against those who perpetrate them. But the United States is not a signatory of the Rome Statute, as actually it's not a signatory of many of the most important international human rights treaties. However, Venezuela is, and because we are victims of this aggression, we are asking the court to determine if there is responsibility in the officials that are promoting these measures against Venezuela, if they are responsible for committing these crimes against humanity, and we'll see what the court says and how that will play out. What is important, I think, is that international relations have to start again traveling the road of diplomacy, of multilateralism, and not of abuse. This isn't a world where we could say that the strongest nation, the one that has the most nuclear weapons, or can do whatever it wants. I mean, that we are civilized. Humanity has to behave in a civilized manner and work within the international law and international framework that we have given each other. Solve differences through diplomacy and not through military aggression or through sanctions, which at the end of the day have the same effect as the military aggression, because we're talking about lives that are being lost.
So I have to say, this morning we keep coming back to this same theme, that it's not that sanctions are not seen as a traditional form of military aggression, and yet they are a form of warfare. And this, again, I just so want our listeners to understand, and this is so much of our work here on the ground in the United States, is starting to educate our population as to these various forms of hybrid warfare, and U.S. unilateral sanctions being a principal one. I will share with you, Carlos, and our listeners, that Paki and I and a number of other of our Code Pinkers here in D.C. attended, I think it was Tuesday, right? We were at a hearing with Elliot Abrams, and which did not finish. I'll just be tactful. It did not finish. Could
we call that was the nonviolent coup? I think.
But one of the things that before he left the room that he shared with the audience was the Venezuelan oil industry, and that that cutting off the ability for Venezuela to trade oil, and also financial sanctions preventing Venezuela from maintaining the extraction equipment and upgrading it, that he said we're very close to completely destroying the principal source of income for the country. And I mean, that, how can that not be defined as warfare? In the business world, that is what Wall Street calls warfare, quote unquote, among themselves, when they do things like that to each other's corporations.
Yeah.
And by the way, if that took place in Wall Street, it would be trying to, some higher authority to solve this. Oh, this is unfair practice, or this is an abuse of power. And I think that's exactly what's going on, and it is a criminal act to for the reasons that they set out. They want regime change in Venezuela. They want a change of government. And just because of that, they're willing to trample on the whole population, or even over their allies, because at the end of the day, everyone gets hurt by these sanctions.
That's right.
I mean, when you look at when you have a population that cannot get timely access to medicine, for example, because, and I'll tell you why, because sometimes the way these sanctions have worked is that we have the money to make the purchases, to bring the medicines that we need from outside, and we are blocked by the banks. And sometimes the banks do it on over-compliance, not even because it's indicated by the executive orders that have been issued for sanctions, but because the banks feel that if they process a payment, I'm not even saying, anything else, but just to process a payment for Venezuela, there might be a risk that the Treasury Department can take some action against the bank, and they're going to lose out. So we don't even want to touch our money. So we have the money sitting there. We need, supplies to cater to our population, and we can do it because the United States, the Trump administration has decided they don't like President Maduro, where, again, just remind people, in a democracy, it's not the United States who decides who the president is, it's the people of Venezuela who decide who the president is. So that's the gist of what's going on. And this is having an impact on all of the population, not just on a small group. And that's why we're denouncing this as a crime.
So you mentioned something about the sanctions preventing the purchase and importation of foods and medicines. Let's take a moment and talk about the importation of medicines, because what we're seeing in Iran right now, as the world is now dealing with what the World Health Organization has determined coronavirus to be a pandemic, and we are seeing unnecessary spread of coronavirus in Iran because they are not able to import medicines and medical supplies to deal with the spread of coronavirus as strongly and rapidly as they could historically do. And so how is Venezuela responding to coronavirus? I know the president gave a talk the other night, and maybe we could talk a little bit about how Venezuelan state-managed healthcare is dealing with coronavirus in Venezuela versus what our privatized system here in the United States is not doing at all.
Well, first of all, I have to say that, fortunately until now, there has not been one case reported yet of coronavirus in Venezuela. So what we're trying to do is, the way this pandemic is working, it is likely that it may come to the country. So what we need to do is prepare, the best way we can. So what we're trying, against the arbitrary measures of these sanctions, these unilateral sanctions, we will look towards multilateralism to be the solution. And the key partner in Venezuela for this has been the World Health Organization, which is a multilateral organization itself, and which is allowing us, helping us to acquire needed medicine as well as the test kits so that we can, test whoever presents some of the symptoms, and we can, better take care of the situation. One of the good things that I've mentioned of having a state health care system, and that is spread out through the Barrio Adentro mission, which led took
the Cuban model.
The Cuban model. When we work sometimes with the Cuban doctors as well, and it's spread out throughout the inner cities and through rural areas in Venezuela, when normally people wouldn't have access to a doctor. It's so spread out that it takes care of preventive medicine. It's one of the key issues. So what's being done throughout our healthcare system and throughout our public media system as well is to have a strong campaign on talking about what the virus is, talking about how it can be contagious. Talking about preventive measures you could take, of how you should wash your hands every so often as much as possible, and all the measures that you could do in order to prevent. I mean, most likely it's not easy. It's not an easy thing to prevent. I mean, we see many countries are suffering from this. But the more information we can get out through our public health system, the more chances we have of combating it. And I think that's very important. And Venezuelans can rely at least on support of the public health system that can give that primary attention. While we know that in other countries where the systems are privatized, it's a lot more difficult, and it's a lot of a stronger strain on the population.
Well, we're basically self-educating and self-quarantining here in the United States. There's really no public infrastructure leading the entire nation through this. I wonder, Carlos, before we let you go, if we could talk just briefly about the U.S. maximum pressure campaign against Venezuela, which is really igniting in the news right now, and what the State Department is referring to as Monroe Doctrine 2.0.
Yeah, so what we've seen during the last year in Venezuela was a failure for the United States to achieve the objective of putting Juan Guaidó as president, and effectively carrying that out. There's no support in the streets for this because he was not an elected president. He was not. Nobody allowed him to be in that position. And because people voted for President Maduro in a majority vote. What I'm trying to get to see is that the failure of achieving that change has prompted again the United States to up its strategy against Venezuela. And in a recent phone call for a press briefing on the Venezuela issue, high officials from State Department from National Security
quote unquote high officials. We don't really know who they were, right?
We don't know who they are, and we like to say that it's because they're so ashamed what they're saying that they don't show their faces. But these officials are saying that now is the time. The time has come to apply the maximum pressure to Venezuela. They've been applying until now about 50% of the pressure, but they don't want to go all the way 100%. But if they have to, they will, and then they'll do this. And then this is crazy rhetoric saying that there has to be they have to apply the new Monroe Doctrine 2.0. Which is the Trump doctrine, which is basically we need to free the hemisphere of foreign influence like Russia and China. So basically, what they're telling all free Latin American countries is you can no longer make your own decisions. We'll make our decisions for you. We'll make your decisions for you, and we'll choose who you have to have as a business partner. And you have to do business with us, and that's basically what they're saying. And in order to do this, they have now they're working with the right-wing governments of Colombia and Brazil. Brazil has already removed their diplomats from Venezuela. They're saying that they're going to expel our diplomats there. They got Colombia to be part of this, and there's very worrisome meetings between officials in Colombia and Brazil was the Southern Command. When we see that, they're doing military exercises. Yesterday, Admiral Paul in Congress said, there was going to be an increase in U.S. military presence throughout the rest of the year in Latin America, meaning ships. And then I come to the ships issue because one of the threats that President Trump has launched forward against Venezuela is of a naval blockade. So this is the how far they're willing to go to, overthrow the government of President Maduro, to inflict pain upon the Venezuelan people, that, they're already up in their strategy with their neighbors and threatening, the safety and the peace of the whole region.
So Carlos, I want to thank you so much for taking this time with us this morning, because you are not without things to do on your desk and across the hemisphere. At this point, but I want to let our listeners know that we Code Pink did a full hour conversation with Carlos Roan yesterday, an hour webinar. So if you would like to hear a deeper discussion on the issues we touched on in the last 20 minutes, please go to codepink.org/videos. You'll find the webinar there. You'll also find it on the Code Pink YouTube channel. And so, Carlos, we look forward to welcoming you back at a future date and having more discussion on U.S. interference in Venezuela.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
The memory of those who fell, the story will always tell. Heroes and martyrs for the cause of peace. In the memory of those who died, 9 names are glorified. We will continue until Gaza's release. For the mothers and children living desperately in the largest concentration camp in history. We're sailing on.
So here we are, continuing our discussion of under the big umbrella of collective punishment. We have our next guest is a wonderful woman, Colonel Ann Wright, retired Colonel Ann Wright, who is coming to us to speak about many things, but primarily the flotilla to Gaza. So welcome, Ann Wright.
Well, thank you, Paki. Great to be with you.
Yeah.
So, Ann, the music that we used to introduce you is called Freedom Flotilla.
Yes?
Yes, that's it. Thank you.
So
I'll just remind our listeners that you're listening to Code Pink Radio. Your co-hosts are Paki, Wieland, and Teri
Mattson, live in Washington, D.C.
And we have as our guest today, coming to us from Houston, Texas, Ann Wright. So, Colonel Ann Wright, you have a long history with the Freedom Flotillas, and it continues. She persists. They persist. We persist. So could you bring us up to date on what's been happening and where we're going next?
Surely. Well, as most people know, the flotilla started actually in 2008, so 12 years ago. 2 small little boats sailed under the name of the Gaza Free Gaza movement, and those 2 little boats that were carrying a total of about 30 passengers somehow were able to evade the Israeli naval blockade of Gaza and broke the blockade. First time in 40 years that international boats had gotten into the Gaza City harbor, which is the only harbor that Gaza has. And, this blockade's been going on for decades now, and it's the only outlet that Gaza has itself for international produce and things like that, but it's just been closed to them. So the international effort to bring attention to the blockade, the sea blockade of Gaza, as well as the land blockade, started 12 years ago. Then in 2010, after the Israeli 20-day attack on Gaza, cast lead, we had a real flotilla of, it was like 7 ships that tried to break the blockade, and that's when the Israeli commandos went after all the passengers on all those ships, but on the Mavi Marmara, a big Turkish passenger ship that had over 600 people on it. They executed 9 of the passengers, wounded 50 more, and one of the wounded has subsequently died. So they killed 10 international people, small numbers compared to what they killed in the West Bank and in Gaza. But the point was that the attention that was brought through the vehicle of these boats sailing to Gaza, the international attention to the plight of the people in Gaza, that's what it's all about. And we've continued from 2010. We had the 2011 flotilla, and Paki, you were on the U.S. boat to Gaza,
yes,
where we...
I was.
Yep. You were. And
I've heard those stories. How far did you get on that trip?
We didn't get very far.
Well, I tell people we sailed to Gaza and we got about 5 miles out of port. But yes.
That's right. And that's where the Israeli government co-opted, paid off the Greek government not to let the vessel sail from Greece. So we were stuck there, although 2 of the boats subsequently went to Turkey and were sailed in the fall of 2011 into Gaza. Then in 2012, we had the Estelle. Over the years, we've had a total of 35 ships that have been a part of these flotillas. The last one was in 2018, where we had 4 ships that did a 70-day voyage from Scandinavia, 2 ships going in the Atlantic, and then 2 down the canals and waterways of Central Europe. And then 2 out of the 4 actually continued on to try to break that blockade of Gaza and were stopped by the Israelis 40 miles off Gaza. We also had the women's boat to Gaza, which was in 2016. That was a very interesting one, with a woman captain and crew members, and we had a Nobel Peace Laureate. We had 2 members of parliament from various countries. This year, in 2020, we will be having another flotilla, and we are doing fundraisers around the United States as a part of the U.S. campaign, which is one of 12 national campaigns around the world, to include Canada, the U.K., Norway, Sweden, Italy, Spain, Australia, New Zealand, Malaysia, South Africa. All have campaigns, and we are raising money to buy more boats. And our plan was to actually sail in May of this year, which would be May of 2020, 10 years after the May of 2010 Israeli attack on the flotilla. However, because of the coronavirus, and because of 3 of the ports we would be visiting on this trip around the Mediterranean before we headed for Gaza, 3 of the ports were in Italy, and out of a very strong abundance of caution, we've decided to postpone the flotilla until September, and we'll let things settle down and then make our decision, which, we're keeping our fingers crossed that things are good in the world and we can have the flotilla sail in September.
So, Ann, one of the 2 of the recurring themes that have come up in the hour of our show have been coronavirus and collective punishment through various forms of U.S. foreign and economic policy. Can you tell us a bit about how U.S. Israeli foreign policy in Gaza is collectively punishing the population there? Give us some examples of how the people are suffering, which is one of the reasons the flotilla goes to
indeed
elevate the issue.
Sales, to elevate, to educate people. Yes, indeed. I mean, when you look at Gaza, which is a tiny little place, 25 miles long, 5 miles wide, over 2 million people now live there. It's one of the most densely populated places in the world, and it is the place where the World Health Organization has said by the year 2020, which is this year, Gaza will become uninhabitable because of the lack of fresh water, which is controlled by the Israelis, the lack of sewage facilities, which are always bombed by the Israelis, the lack of electricity, which comes from electric wires that come from Israel and are turned off, so that most of the time people are getting less than 3 hours of electricity a day. So trying to keep food refrigerated, trying to keep lights on so kids can study. The whole issue of hospital care, of how many medicines, how much hospital equipment is allowed in by the Israeli government, because they control all the borders, all the land borders, with the exception of the Rafah border from Egypt. But there's a deal that's been cut with the Egyptians to just put the squeeze on Gaza. So very few materials come through from Egypt, and very few people are now allowed to leave Gaza through the Rafah border. It's a very miserable existence with when the Israelis also are flooding agricultural fields with sewage water, purposely flooding agricultural fields, where they are purposely not allowing kids to come out of Gaza to take international scholarships that they have applied for and have earned, and yet they're unable to get out of Gaza to accept them.
See, as we're sitting listening to you describe the living conditions, humanitarian conditions, or lack thereof on the ground in Gaza, again, this is a repeated theme we're hearing this morning, is a foreign power economically, physically making life so difficult for a population that they capitulate, that they either flee or overthrow their government. Is that an objective here in Gaza as well?
Well, indeed, it's an objective by the Israeli government as well as the U.S. government, that was horrified that in a free and fair election, Hamas, the political party, actually won the election in 2007 in Gaza. And the U.S. was horrified that this could have happened, and they have joined with Israel and the blockade. They have cut the amount of money. I mean, that now the United States gives, I think it's essentially no money to the UN Works and Relief Agency, which is the UN body which has been helping Palestinian refugees, not only in Gaza, the West Bank, but in Jordan, in Lebanon. The U.S. has just cut the funding for that to put more pressure on the Palestinians, particularly those in Gaza.
So a maximum pressure campaign of sorts, so to speak. It's, here's our challenge, and you're a perfect person to address this, is that these techniques are really a form of warfare. Here we are back again talking about hybrid forms of warfare that are not recognized as in the traditional sense of warfare.
Yeah.
Well, indeed, that's so true, because what the U.S. government will say is, well, we're not killing them, we're not shooting them. So this
in the
is
conventional sense of the term.
A benevolent way to put pressure. Well, when in fact it is killing them.
Right.
It is killing the people in all of these countries where the U.S. has sanctions, whether it's in Venezuela, whether it's in Bolivia, whether it's in Nicaragua, whether it's in Yemen, the list just goes on and on and on. And it is having its effect. Like in Iraq during the Clinton administration, that's when over 500,000 kids died because of the sanctions the U.S. had on Iraq after Gulf War I.
Right.
So but it's the way the bureaucrats, and I was one of the bureaucrats. That's the way the bureaucracy of the U.S. is able to rationalize what it's doing, to say we are still a very benevolent country. See, we're not bombing them. Although,
right.
The last 15, 18 years, we've bombed them all first and then put sanctions on them later.
Yeah, we're going to starve them.
Yeah, and we have to say goodbye. But I just want to remind people that if you're more interested in hearing more, because there's so much more that we haven't had a chance to hear from you, that we will be Skyping Ann in tomorrow night, Friday night, March 13th, at Busboys and Poets, K Street, 6 p.m. Come, and there'll be other people. There'll be some folks from Gaza and others who have been working with flotillas and with the people on the ground. So please, thank you very much for this time this morning, Ann, and I will look forward to seeing you on the big screen tomorrow.
Indeed, and thank you all, and usvote2gaza.org if people want to make a donation. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Go CODEPINK Radio. Woo-hoo.
Woo. Thanks.
Bush and Bin Laden, you think they're foes? They're in business together. Daddy Bush knows the Carlyle Group since years before been raking in billions and itching for more. It's blood for oil.